Hello everyone, in this video I would introduce you to the Query Editor, which is a very important tool used within Power BI. The Query Editor should be the first tool you use when you build a report within Power BI, simply because it is used to connect to data sources, define and apply transformations. So let's take a very quick look at the few notes we have right here about using the Query Editor. Like we said earlier, it's the first tool used within Power BI because it is used to connect to the different data sources, and it's mainly used to add or delete columns or rows. Also, it could be used to merge a table with another table or append several tables together, and many other transformations as we would see during the course. Another important thing about the Query Editor is that it could be used to change the column name and position within the table. Let's see very quickly how we can change a column name within the Query Editor. To change a column name, all we need to do is to double click the column name header and write down the new name that we would like to assign to this column, then press enter. To change the order of the columns in this table, although this wouldn't affect any transformations we make, but just in case it makes more sense to you to have these columns in a certain order, to change the order of the column, we just need to drag and drop that column where we need it to be. We can also right click this column and choose whether we would like it to be moved to the left, or move to the right, or even to the beginning of the table or the end of the table. Another important thing that we need to understand about the Query Editor is that any changes we make within the Query Editor do not affect the original data source. For example, here we are dealing with the sales table. Say for example that I would delete all the columns except for that column titled promotion key and apply the changes. You would notice that in the data view, that table right now has only one column, even though if we open the data source in Excel, we can see that the data source has not been affected and it still has all the columns it had there before applying any changes. In other words, the Query Editor takes a copy or gets a copy of the original data source and applies the transformation over that copy without touching the original data source, without making any changes to the original data source. Okay, so we covered this point already, saying that the changes made do not affect the data source, and by now I guess you have understood already that the changes affect the table shown in the data view within Power BI. So only the table that is shown over here is affected by the transformations we make. Another important point regarding the Query Editor is that the changes we made are all recorded within a list that's called the applied steps list. So if we go back to the Query Editor, you would see that on the right hand side over here, all the steps I have made are recorded with their names. So over here it says that I have removed other columns, and if I look over this bar I can see which column I have used to define what I mean by other columns. So it says here that I have removed all the columns except for promotion key. The other steps over here also define what I have made or what step I have applied. So it says here reorder columns, which is pretty much self-explanatory, meaning that I have reordered the columns or changed the order of the columns. And here I renamed the columns, changed the type of some columns, and promoted headers and so on. Also, you need to understand that all the steps we make are recorded within the Advanced Editor using the M language. To understand what I'm talking about, let's go back to the Query Editor. So as we said earlier, the steps are recorded on the applied steps list. That's for easier understanding of what's going on. If you'd like to get deep and dirty, you can go to the Advanced Editor from this icon over here, where you can see the actual code that was used to apply each single step. So the Advanced Editor M language always follows the following pattern. A script written in M language starts with the word let. That's to declare that this is the start of the script. Then, for each single step, the step needs to be given a name. Like over here it says source, then equals to define the code for that step. Then, when the line of code dedicated for that step ends, it must be ended with a comma, like over here. So as you can see, every single line follows the same pattern. It starts by defining the name of the step, then an equal sign, then defines the code used within that step, and finally ends with a comma. Except for the last step taken within that script. The last step starts with defining the name of the step, then an equal sign to define the code used within that step, but it doesn't end with a comma. And finally, the script must end by the word n to define that this is the end of the script, and the final step to be returned must be declared by the end of the script over here. So this is the last step that was taken within that code, and it's written down after the word n to declare that this is the step for which we would like to show the final result or the final table. Although it's nice to understand how the M language works, you would rarely need to visit the advanced editor to apply transformations, as all the transformations you might need to apply could be applied using the functions and the methods we would learn during this chapter. For now, I'll just press cancel. So the next important thing we need to know about the query editor is that the applied steps could be deleted and the order of their execution could be changed. So over here I have renamed the column titled product key to be called product. And on the previous step I have changed the types of a few columns. The steps listed on the applied steps list are executed in the same order they are listed, meaning that Power BI would first change the types of the columns listed on this step or mentioned on this step, then it would rename that column. If for some reason I would like to change the order of execution to make Power BI first rename the column, then change the types of the other columns. So first rename the product key column and then change the types of the other columns. I would simply drag this column, I would like to change its order, and drop it in the place where I would like it to be executed. So now the renaming function will be applied first, then the type change function or operation will be applied. Of course, we need to understand that it's not always that smooth to change the order of execution for steps, simply because sometimes steps might be dependent over the previous steps. For example, the last step we have applied here says removed other columns, and the step before reorders the columns. If I drag this step to make it executed first, then if I move to the reorder columns, it would return an error, simply because I have deleted all the columns except for the promotion key columns on this step. So over here, when I ask Power BI to order the columns in the order mentioned here, it must return an error because almost all of these columns do not exist anymore. So say for example, I don't need to have this step anymore. In that case, all I need to do is to simply click on this X icon to delete the step. Now, going back to the PowerPoint presentation, the next thing we need to understand about the query editor is that it only shows a preview of the data. It doesn't show the entire table. The entire table could be seen only in the data view. Let's go back to the query editor to figure out what that means exactly. So over here, it's showing that that table has 999 rows. This is not actually the number of rows we have on the table. This is just the number of rows shown on the preview for the table. So, as it would take a long time to apply the transformations we might want to apply over a large number of rows, the query editor applies these transformations over the first or the top 1000 rows and shows us how that table would look like after applying that transformation. But for applying that transformation over the entire table, we need to press close and apply. Also, if we go back to the original table, you would see that we have over 100,000 rows on that table, which again clarifies the idea that the query editor only shows us a preview. So if we are done with the transformations we need to apply over the query editor, and we need to see how the table would look like after applying these transformations, we need to click close and apply in order to see how the table looks like in the data view. Now, going back to the PowerPoint presentation, the query editor always shows us the number of columns we have in a table. If we go back to the query editor, you can see that on the bottom left corner, the query editor is listing the number of columns we have in the table and also the number of rows we have in the table. If we have less than 999 rows, it would mention the exact number of rows. Otherwise, it would just mention 999 plus or over 999 rows. Now, if we go to a table with fewer rows, like this table, it would tell us the exact number of rows we have on the table as long as it is less than 999 rows. Going back to the PowerPoint presentation, next we would talk about the query right-click options. So you have noticed already that each single table is called through a different query. Now, if we right-click that query over here, you would see that we have a couple of options and a couple of operations we can apply over that query. So we can, for example, copy and paste that query to create a duplicate. And if we don't need that duplicate anymore, we can delete it from here. And we can even make it easier to create a duplicate by choosing duplicate. And we can rename that query from here. Of course, to rename the query, you can either click on this option over here, or you can simply double click the query name. Additionally, we can choose to show that query in the data view or not. Say, for example, that you have imported that table that you only use to merge with another table, and you don't need to show that table in the final view of the data. In that case, you would simply uncheck enable load and click continue, and the next time you press close and apply, the table will not be loaded to the data view in your model. Again, that could be a very good option in case you are calling this table only to merge it with another table and you don't need to eventually use it within your model to make visualizations. Now, going back to the query editor, and by clicking on the sales table, you would see that we have a few more options, like whether to include that table in report refresh. That simply means that if you remove the check mark, when you refresh your model the next time, that table will not be refreshed. That could be a good option in case you have a very large table which rarely changes, and you have within the same model other tables, other smaller tables which change frequently. Then in that case, you can simply do not include the large table which rarely changes or never changes at all in the report refresh to make the refresh faster, and include the tables which change frequently in the report refresh. The next option is to duplicate, which we have discovered earlier. The following option is to reference. That means to create another query that is dependent over the query we are referencing. So, for example, if we click reference, it would create another query, and that query would pull the last result we get from the sales query. So if we go back to the sales query and delete that last step, so now we have 21 columns, then we go to the query we just used to reference the original sales query, you will see that that query now has 21 columns as it's referencing the sales table. Now if we delete this query and go back to the sales query, we have a few more options. So the next option is to move to group. When you have many queries or many tables that you import to your model, it could be a good idea to organize these queries into groups so that it would be easier for you to identify what that query, so that it would be easier for you to organize your queries. So to move the query into a group, we simply need to go to the move to group icon, then choose new group and name that group that we would like to create. It might also be nice to write down some description to better understand the content of this group or what queries should be added to that group. And finally click OK. Then a folder icon would be created with the name of the group you just created, and the query would be added to that group. In case you'd like to add any other query to that group, you simply need to right click over that query and choose the group name that you would like to move that query to. And going back to the sales table, the next option we have is to move up or down in terms of the orders of the queries, which is only for organizing purposes. So it doesn't really affect how the queries are executed or the order of execution for the queries. This is just for organizing purposes. The next two options is to create function or convert to parameter. The next option is to go to the advanced editor or show the steps applied for that query in advanced editor, which is equivalent to clicking on advanced editor from here. And finally, the last option is for properties, where you can add some description for this query to help you to remember what this query entails, and that would also help you to document your model. Now going back to the PowerPoint presentation. So the steps we make on the query editor do not reflect on the data view tables until we apply these steps. If we go back to the query editor, you would notice that, for example, we have disabled the sales table from loading, and now it's enabled to be loaded. But if we go to the data view, you would see that we don't have any tables because we haven't applied the last changes we have made within the query editor. So if we hit apply changes, the sales table would be loaded to the data view and we can use it from here. Going back to the PowerPoint presentation, the final thing we need to do is how to apply the changes we make within the query editor. So if we go back to the query editor for the last time, you would notice on the top left corner on the home tab that we have an icon that says close and apply. I have repeatedly clicked this icon many times during this video. So the whole purpose of this icon is to apply the steps we make within the query editor. If you click on this drop down, you would notice that we have three options. The first one is to close and apply, which is exactly the option you would get by clicking on the icon itself. The second one is to apply without closing, which means that the changes you make within the query editor will be applied and the query editor will not be closed. And the last one is to close the query editor without applying the changes you have made. So for example, let us for one more time remove other columns. Now if we go back here, so if we close and apply, I'm pretty sure you know by now what would happen. The query editor would close and the last changes we have made would be applied. But if we click on apply, the changes we make within the query editor would be applied in the data view, but the query editor will not be closed. And finally, if we remove that last step and just hit close, the query editor would be closed and none of the changes we have made would be applied over that table until, of course, we hit apply changes. And that's all we need to know as an introduction to the query editor. If you like this type of content, subscribe to our channel, hit like, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. And by the way, we also offer Power BI consulting and training services at www.powerbimaster.com. See you in the next video.